sit back and enjoy the Mistress of Horror.
I will start by saying this. I am a scientist, studied at Imperial College of Science in London, and I am a rationalist, and I'm an atheist. I do not believe in ghosts or the immortal souls of the departed. I do not believe in UFOs, and I do not believe in Fox News. Now on with the story. I was working and living in Indonesia a few years ago, and it was around Christmas. I was left to be the only person living in the shared house that I had been in for about 2 weeks. Nothing ever creepy had happened as far as I knew, and no one ever said anything, nor were there any whispers. The only thing that was other than totally normal, with hindsight, was on the day I arrived. The head of the mission, my boss, was sitting outside on the steps, even though the door was unlocked. He told me he just didn't like to go into other houses alone. I didn't think about it or ponder over it too much. Anyway, over the weeks I was there, more and more people go back to their villages until it was only me and another English guy on the pre-ultimate night. Again, nothing weird happens. Next day, he goes. I'm quite happy in houses by myself and spend an easy evening watching Home Alone 2 with, at times, the security guard, who I then sent home around midnight. I go to bed expecting a lousy Christmas alone the next day. I need to mention, I hadn't drank or taken drugs, and I've never even done hallucinogens. With that being said, I've been in bed for about 5 minutes, and I'm doing my usual looking around the room from bed before my eyes close. There are street lights outside, and the light comes in through the window, making the room relatively well lit. All of a sudden, I just can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone in the room. It's a strong, strong presence, as strong as when there is actually someone in there, and I just couldn't explain it. I looked a bit more from my bed. It was funny because from the way I was lying, the light came in the windows and made it look as if there was a woman wearing a long black dress like robes and an Islamic headscarf, a hijab, type surrounding her face, like Indonesians wear, stood by the window. The more I looked, and looked away, and looked back again, the more it seemed like she was really actually there. If it hadn't been for the seemingly invisible part of her main torso, I would have sworn that I was looking at an actual woman, late 40s or so, severe looking, and really, really angry. I could literally feel the menace through the entire room, and it was a huge room for a bedroom. Right. This is the point when I would stop believing you if you were the one telling me this story. Sorry, but I'm a rationalist and believe that there is a reasonable explanation that does not include anything supernatural or even experienced. As a rule, I still don't believe people who claim to have seen ghosts. I think they are mistaken, or a momentary, unexplained shadow must have tricked their eyes or brain or something. I know, this is very ironic. Back to my story. She moved. Right across the window, through the beam of light from outside. Right to the foot of my bed. And she stood there, looking at me as severely as if she was furious that I was there. I looked right at her face, right into her eyes, and saw nothing but anger. Although her body was indistinct and her torso was seemingly see-through, her face was as clear and as well-defined as any I have ever seen in my life. To say I was terrified is a complete understatement. My heart beat so fast I genuinely feared that I might have a heart attack and die in that bed right there. I pulled the duvet over my head, I pulled it down again, and she was still there. I was too scared to say anything at all, but I could move and I could feel everything. Through her body, I could see the alarm clock and I could see the time. She stayed there, growing in menace and presence for something like 35 minutes. I'm not too proud to admit that I was so scared I was almost in tears. For over half an hour, it was just me and her, staring at each other in this room. After all that time, and just when I thought that it was getting too much, and she would attack me or I would die of fright, her body dissolved and transformed into what I can only describe as little balls of light, different sizes from 1 to 10 centimeters across, but all white. They danced and span above the bed for another few minutes. I was completely certain I was about to die and went under the sheets again, panicked and terrified. And then, out of nowhere, I felt her presence disappear. I could feel I was in the room alone again. I couldn't feel the rage, the presence, or the malevolence that I had felt, so I peeked up from under the sheets. The lights were gone, and I was alone. I jumped out of bed and scouted around the house. No one was there. Nothing was, or felt, unusual at all. I went back to bed and slept well. A year or so later, my brother's girlfriend looked into buying that exact house. She told me it had been on the market for over 10 years and was going cheap. Really, really cheap, even though it was a luxurious place. Why so cheap? Apparently, no one wanted to live in it because the locals said they were afraid of the ghost.
Here is a story that I have not shared before, because it creeps me the hell out. I don't like thinking about it. I don't like the things it implies about the nature of the universe in which we inhabit, and it fills me with existential dread. It also happens to involve a friend's suicide, so it's not the easiest thing in the world to talk about, even without the paranormal stuff. Names have been changed to protect the privacy of the other people in this story, both living and dead. About 7 years ago, my friend Dave took his own life. Tragic though it wasn't much of a shocker for those of us who knew him. The dude had always had some serious issues with depression, and he threatened to end his life before many times. Add to this the fact that he had recently separated from his wife and moved back in with his brother and was using meth again. And yeah, the writing was pretty much on the wall. About 3 weeks after his death, his widow Jessica, who happened to be my best friend, came to see me. She was clearly upset. She shoves her cell phone into my hand and tells me that I need to hear this voicemail. She doesn't tell me anything about it, so I listen. It was static, but underneath the static, there was a voice. It sounded like it was coming far away from a very bad connection. It was Dave's voice. I would have recognized his gruff baritone anywhere, and he was shouting my friend's name over and over again. Jessica! Jessica? Hey, Jessica! Jessica? Jessica? Hearing his voice, knowing that he was almost a month underground, and the fact that he sounded so desperate and afraid made my blood run cold. I handed the phone back to Jessica and just kind of stared at her stupidly for a moment. "That was Dave," I finally said when I could speak. "I know," she replied. The voicemail had apparently shown up in her voicemail inbox with no record of missed calls and no phone numbers attached to it. We both listened to it again 3 or 4 times just to be sure, but when Jessica went to show someone else a few days later, she was surprised to discover that it had spontaneously deleted itself. It was just gone. About a week or so after that, my ex-husband Ivan stopped by to drop off our sons for our shared custody agreement. He had been Dave's best friend since childhood, so even though things were kind of tense between the two of us, I wanted to let him know how sorry I was and that he shouldn't blame himself for not being there. We talked about Dave for a few minutes, and I mentioned the strange voicemail that Jessica had received. Far from being shocked like I thought he would, he simply nodded knowingly. "I got one too," he said. Same thing. Static, but his voice underneath. Only he was screaming my name. And my phone usually showed that voicemail and a few other missed calls from Dave's cell phone. I never heard the phone ring. And this was all weeks after he died. I was pretty disturbed by this, so I began casting out for explanations. Was it possible that Dave's phone was still malfunctioning? Maybe his brother was carrying it around in his back pocket and butt dialing it. Maybe the family hadn't turned it off yet. Ivan rejected each proposed explanation, since he had already investigated. Apparently, Dave's family had terminated his phone service within a couple of days of his death. It should have been impossible for his phone to make any calls. And while butt dialing might explain how a dead person's phone could make a call weeks after the owner's death, well, it doesn't really explain those voicemails. I asked Ivan if I could listen to the voicemails on his phone, but he shook his head. It's gone. It just disappeared after a few days. So did all the records of missed calls from Dave's number. I went to show them to somebody and suddenly they weren't there. It's been many years, but thinking about that voicemail still makes me break out into goosebumps. It was frightening to me for many reasons. For one, I don't like thinking that my friend Dave, who was so tormented in life, would still continue to be so in death. I don't like how he sounded in that voicemail. He sounded terrified. I struggled with depression myself, and there have been times in the year since when I have found myself staring over a literal or proverbial ledge, contemplating to end it all. But always the memory of the voicemail and of Dave's voice will come to me, and I take myself down. Because wherever Dave was calling from, I don't want to end up there.
My grandfather, Papa, died in a car accident when I was still an infant. Naturally, my mother, always a daddy's girl, tried to ensure that I had some idea and concept of him growing up. We had dozens upon dozens of photos of Papa and my grandmother around our home, and I spent my very early childhood with a solid idea of what my grandfather looked like in life, with the exception of his height. For some strange reason, every photograph was taken while he was sitting. But it was definitely him, with his dark hair and eyes and spectacularly 70s glasses. I don't remember when it started, but I began to get visits from Papa. He would come into my room at night and sit on the foot of my bed. It was never frightening because I knew it was just Papa. He would stand by my pillow and brush my hair from my forehead. He would pull the blankets around my chin, and he would often just stand in the doorway, silhouetted against the living room light. I remember exactly where he stood too on the doorframe due to the stickers I had placed everywhere. He was very short. He came only up to the scratch and sniff pickle, and he never spoke. Never. His eyes didn't look the same in the photographs either. They looked red, and sometimes they even looked like they glowed. But this didn't bother me as I was a very young child, and I thought this was normal. These visits went on for many years. One Christmas, I decided that I wanted to make Papa a card. I worked very hard on my construction paper and glitter monstrosity for several hours. Eventually, I caught the attention of my mother, who wanted to know who the card was for. I told her it was for Papa, and when she didn't seem too concerned, I told her all about his nightly visits and how nice I thought it was that he still came to see his granddaughter. She asked a few more questions about what he did, and I grew more excited and rushed over to my bedroom door to show her where he stood. "Do you think he can smell the pickle?" I remember asking, because that's right where his head is. It was then that I learned from my mother that my grandfather had not been a short man at all. My stickers came up to about 5 feet, but according to my mother, my grandfather was 6'4". I have no idea who the short man with the glowing red eyes was who visited me for so many years, but my mother swears it was not her father, and I believe her.
Okay, so this year I can participate, since the main player who would be scandalized by airing the laundry has passed. As background, my mother had me in her late 30s, and her mother in turn had her in her late 30s. My mother is the youngest of 8 children, and had brothers much older than she, which is how I have an uncle that is more than 50 years older than me. I went to university in the 80s, to the same southern university that most of my family attended. My sophomore year, I met a senior aerospace engineer student and crushed on him badly. He looked like Peter O'Toole, circus Lawrence of Arabia, and we'll call him Pete. Walking across campus one day with my gorgeous roommate, we ran into Pete, and I thought I'd show off by speaking to him. This backfired, as he was clearly interested in Rumi, and asked her to come to a game night in his dorm room that Friday, but apparently I was invited too. The senior engineers lived in a quad area of the old historical dorms, touted as historical, but in reality just old and unrefurbished. Rumi and I went. There were about 12 people and various board and drinking games. Fun times, even though I was still crushing on Pete unrequited. Partway through the evening, Rumi took a sip of beer and said, "Gross. Dang guys, who put Pepsi in my beer?" The guy laughed and said, "Oh, probably our ghost." They went on to tell her that they would come back to the room and find all the books on a shelf turned around, spines in, or that everything in the medicine cabinet would be out and laying in the sink, and food left out would be covered in salt and pepper. Silly prankish things, and stuff moved around that they finally had attributed to a ghost. I said out of nowhere, maybe it was my Uncle Bennett. And then there was silence. I couldn't have stopped the party any better if I'd screamed at the top of my lungs in the middle of the room. Feeling uncomfortable, I just kept talking to cover it up, and said that my Uncle Bennett Foster had attended the school in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and had been the victim of an unfortunate accident. He used what he thought was mouthwash that turned out to be something else entirely, and died due to poisoning. Pete told me to come over to his closet. Carved into the rolled wooden edge of the shelf on the left at about eye level was the full name of my Uncle Bennett. Now that would have been spooky enough, but there's more to the story. Pete and Rumi started dating, and they also started investigating the ghost of my Uncle Bennett. When they went to the records office of the university, they found that his roommate back in the day was Matthew Shue, from the same town as my uncle. And then they checked the university newspaper archives for information on Matthew so they could maybe speak to him. Turned out Matthew had died a few years previously in prison. He was in there serving a life sentence for murdering his wife Dorothy by poisoning.
2 years ago, around late September, early October, I experienced something that I truly believe to be malevolent and paranormal in nature. I was living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, think Yorkville. I rented a seriously small, first floor front of the building studio apartment, around 350 square feet, maybe even less, and it was a loft, so my bed was above the kitchen/bathroom, and there was a gigantic window out to the street. I also have an 8-pound miniature pinscher named Miniature, who thinks she's the ultimate guard dog. Setting details here. One night, I was clicking through the internet watching police brutality videos because the Trayvon Martin case was flooding the media, and I just kept on clicking YouTube suggested videos, torturing myself. Somehow, I eventually clicked on some video. I don't even know how I stumbled across this shit, but it looked like a documentary or home video made like 30-something years ago. I swear this shit was absolutely real, and it definitely dealt with the occult. There was something weird happening. For almost 7 minutes, I sat watching this shitty old video. I was pretty confused about what I was watching, and then what can only be described as a child, maybe 10, who is either seriously suffering from the most intense mental disturbance ever, or actual demonic possession, started doing horrible things to another child, and I closed the computer window immediately. I shut down my computer, stood up, and paced the hell out of my apartment for a good 15 minutes. I was shaking and crying, and I wanted to throw up. I couldn't believe what I had just watched. I felt fear I genuinely can't explain. I only know it made me feel real terror. I called a friend and talked about normal things for a while, not mentioning anything about what I watched. Just to clear my mind of it. I had a glass of wine. I put my dog in my loft and crawled up, and then went to sleep. All normal. Except around 3 a.m. that night, I was woken up by a very bright, flashing light. I honestly thought someone was taking pictures outside my window. I couldn't see the source of the flashing light, but it wasn't the light in my apartment, I could tell, and coming from the window was the only other reasonable option. I lay there, terrified, trying to think of what I should do. Finally, I grabbed the crowbar that I keep next to my bed, and I crawled down from my loft to peek out the window. Nothing. I figure I must be crazy. So I crawled back up to my loft, and I lay my head down. My TV downstairs below turns on. I think, maybe I stepped on the remote when I was downstairs. I didn't. The remote was absolutely on the coffee table. I crawl back down, turn off the TV. I stand there for a second to confirm that the TV is, in fact, off. All of a sudden, I hear music coming from my loft, and my dog is whimpering like crazy. I crawl back up to find my iPhone, which is plugged in on the opposite end of my loft, 4 feet away from where I sleep, has started playing music. I had never heard this song before. I freaked out, grabbed my dog and my phone, turned on all of the lights, and I watched Golden Girls until I had to go to work. While I was getting ready to leave for work, my dog continuously barks at nothing in my loft. I go to work, I come back, and I unlock my door. When I open it, something is partially blocking the entrance. It's my dresser, which sits next to my front door. It's a New York City loft, remember? I have to use all of my weight to push my door and dresser open enough to weasel my way in. My dog is shaking in the corner. I move the dresser back and close the door. I then decide to watch the news. And then my friend comes over. We're hanging out, laughing, catching up. I get up to go use the restroom, and when I walk back to the main area, my friend has a horrified look on her face. She says everything on my coffee table fell over sideways, like all at once, and she didn't bump into it or anything. Obviously, this scares the hell out of me. But I don't mention what happened the night before because I honestly just don't want to talk or think about it. My friend leaves and I go to bed. 3 a.m. The bright flashing light, but I hear a knocking on my wall this time. Not from the door, from the wall, next to my head. I grab my dog and I close my eyes and tell myself it's not real over and over until I finally fall asleep. I wake up and I feel so sick. Like irritable and on edge. I get ready for work. My dog is barking at the loft, and I leave for work. Then I come home. I open my door. All the books on my bookshelf have not just fallen off, they've been scattered around my apartment. On my couch, in my kitchen, throughout my living room, my coffee table, and my coffee table has moved like 4 feet. I sit on my couch in shock, wondering if I've been robbed, but nothing is missing. My doors and windows were locked tight. I live in New York City, so that's obvious. As I'm sitting on the couch, a lamp, like 5 feet away from me, breaks, shatters into pieces. I decide to FaceTime one of my best friends in Texas because I'm just really unsettled and need to talk to a person where I can see them. My friend and I talk for like an hour, laughing, etc. And randomly, I see what looks like a speck out of the corner of my eye. Mind you, this is fall in New York City, where it gets dark well before I leave for work for the day. This is not the glare from the sun. I decide not to pay attention to it, but as I continue the conversation with my friend, I see she has a look of horror on her face. Now, I haven't mentioned the sinister shit of late at all. So when she tells me she saw a face next to my face, like a face that looked like it was screaming at my face, I freak the hell out. I tell her I have to go. I immediately pour a glass of wine and call my very religious cousin and ask her a billion questions about ghosts or whatever. She tells me things that only make me feel more unsettled, so I just ask her to pray or whatever with me right now, because I am truly, truly scared. I'm not a religious person, but I urgently felt the need to pray. Nothing happened that night. In fact, I made my cousin pray over the phone with me every night for a week. And things happened, though less often, with the flashing lights and the knocking and the music playing, and the things knocking over and my dog barking at nothing. I still felt a very dark, ominous presence. I bought sage to burn. I spoke with a priest. I bought holy water, the whole 9 yards. One night, I came home very drunk from a night out, and my dog was whimpering and running around in a circle, like her bum was hurting. I picked her up and I just lost it. I started yelling, "Listen, I'm moving out in like 2 months. I don't give a hell about you. You don't scare me at all. And if you screw with my dog, I will find a way to kill you, whoever you are. Understand? Now go the fuck away." And then I crawled up to my loft with my dog and passed out. I wasn't much afraid of the thing after that, and it didn't screw with my dog ever again. I moved out 2 months later. I'm not really sure if this had anything to do with that creepy YouTube video, but needless to say, I don't watch random YouTube videos anymore.